Oh, hello, I'm TJB Chris from the future. I've just finished the rough cut of this video and it's 1 hour and 46 minutes long. And I thought to myself, that's probably a tad too long for a YouTube video. So, given the content in this video, actually it makes a lot of sense to split it up into two parts, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Part 1 will focus on server setup, MS-DOS, and Windows 3.1, and we'll jump back into Windows 95 in Part 2. So I hope you enjoy, and keep in mind while you're watching this Part 1 that I didn't know I was going to do this until now, so when I'm talking about what we're going to do in this video, you're just going to have to give me some creative license here. Okay, enjoy. Hey everyone, I'm TJB Chris. Welcome back to the channel. It's great to have you. And as you can see, I have a bit of a mission control setup going on here. Now, longtime viewers of the channel probably are aware that I don't do a lot of what I'd call mainline x86 content, you know, MS-DOS, Windows, things like that, unless it's in service to restoring, repairing, or upgrading one of my Tandy computers, or Tandy specific, like, you know, Deskmate Workgroup Companion. But either way, tonight we're going to do another video along those lines, because we're going to touch on something that I have been fascinated with, yet never done, since back in the mid-1990s as a teenager when I was reading the Windows 95 resource kit and I first learned that Windows 95 could boot without a hard disk. Now, most of us assume that Windows requires a hard disk. Hell, the system requirements say it does. But it turns out that's not entirely true. You can boot it without disks in your system over a network, providing you have, you know, the appropriate server setup and you have the appropriate network hardware, which of course, when I was a teenager and growing up when that stuff was expensive, didn't exactly have. So tonight, we're going to use two of my Tandy computers from very late in Tandy's time in the computer business. We're going to use them as diskless boot clients for MS-DOS. We're going to top Windows 3.1 on top of MS-DOS, and we're going to do this with Windows 95. And as our server operating system and server, we're going to be introducing a new machine to the channel. I've had it for a while, but it's going to be making its debut tonight, and it's going to be running Windows NT Server 4.0 Enterprise Edition. So let's take a look at tonight's contenders in terms of computers. We'll talk a little about them, and then we'll talk about a few caveats for the project, and finally we'll dive right in. Let's do it. And here we are with the Tandy machines. First up, we have my Tandy 2500 SX25. You've seen this machine on the channel a number of times. I've done upgrades, I've done overviews. It's got more video memory now, it's got a coprocessor in it, it's got 16 megs of memory, it's got a 386 SX25 processor, and in place of a hard drive, it's got the XT IDE Universal BIOS installed on its network card, and that's feeding this SD card, doing all the translation for that, and that is my hard drive. So, as you can see, the hard drive is currently present. We'll talk about that in a minute, but this is going to be my MS-DOS and Windows machine. Then over here we have the Tandy Multimedia PC, MMPC Model 20. This machine has made its debut on the channel before. This machine has a 486 DX4 overdrive processor running at 100 megahertz. It's got itself a real spinning Rust 4 gigabyte hard drive in there, which I will be disconnecting. Also has the XT IDE Universal BIOS installed on the network card, which we will be summarily removing because, well, diskless, and I'm going to need that spot for the option ROM in the network card. So these are my two Tandy machines. Now let's take a quick look at our server. The server is a Dell Dimension XPST 600R, the College Bro machine. I call it the College Bro machine because it dates from around 1999 and was often used by college students. I know because I was in college and I had its slower brother, the XPST 450. I also know that because this particular machine, when I got it, reeked of college. It's like the dude that owned it bathed in body spray, man. Anyway, this machine has in it 384 megabytes of RAM. It has a fairly large hard drive that it has a partition installed on it with Windows NT set down to 2 gigabytes. The Windows NT version installed is Windows NT Enterprise Server version 4.0, and I've only installed the base operating system on this. So it only has Windows NT and whatever comes when you install it from the CD-ROM. It is set up as a primary domain controller and has a couple of additional components that Enterprise Edition installs for Internet Information Server, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. They're just going to make things a little more convenient for me when I'm preparing the server for diskless boot for these two clients here. So now that we've met our workstations and server, let's talk a little bit more about the specifics of this project. So of course, as I mentioned, booting these soon-to-be diskless workstations is going to be Windows NT Server 4.0 Enterprise Edition. Now this is going to be running on its own isolated network. I will not be running it on my home network with my, you know, all my Wi-Fi's and my stuff. This is going to be isolated. I suggest you do the same. We're talking about old servers running old server software, listening on ports that will probably have security vulnerabilities, and while my network is not directly network accessible, it's better off to keep it separate. And it stops me from having to chase any waterfalls that might be introduced by running this on a network with other machines on it. With that said, that means that I will be installing some additional items on the server here, in addition to the remote boot items that are strictly necessary just for the sake of my own convenience in setting this up, but I will point out when they are not required. Now, you're going to need at least one piece of documentation, and honestly, you're better off with two. And that first piece of documentation is this. This is Chapter 15 from the Windows NT Server Resource Kit Networking Guide. Honestly, this is it. If you have this, and you understand your hardware and have drivers and everything else necessary, you can probably be successful. This is a pretty good document, and because it comes later than my other document, the Windows 95 Resource Kit, it is the controlling document in my mind. It has the most up-to-date information. Windows NT came out about a year after Windows 95, and this guide is really the most correct. Now that said, I did mention this, the Windows 95 Resource Kit, seen here in big booky form. I actually have the book. I love the book. The book is great. You know, pages, prints, that smell. And this is where I learned that you could do diskless boot. And now, a note about NICs, network interface cards. So the biggest hindrance or the biggest proponent to your success in this project, in my mind, is the network card of your choice in your diskless clients. Now, your server card is less important as long as you can get it to run with Windows NT. But in terms of the clients, you need a card that is supported by your client operating systems, particularly Windows 95. This is important. Now, you can use adapters that don't come with out-of-the-box support from Windows 95. It is possible to configure the remote boot server to distribute its drivers and make it work, but it does complicate things rather greatly. It's also worth pointing out that Windows NT Server does come with DOS-based network drivers for a number of cards, including the card I've selected, and those cards tend to also be included in the default install of Windows 95. So I would highly recommend that. Oh, and while we're on the subject of Windows 95, you should be using the retail release of Windows 95. That is the version released on 8/24/1995, and that is version 4.00.950 with no letter suffix. This is the version that the documentation was written against. That is the version that contains the necessary utilities that are on the Windows 95 CD that we have to use to help set up this server, and it is, as far as I know, the supported version. I have a version of Windows 95C. It does not include the network setup program. Now, it is worth pointing out that the Windows NT 4 Enterprise Edition CD does appear to include a copy of Windows 95 on it, but you want the original retail release. And if you're looking at your media and you want to figure out if you have that release without digging around, you can look in the rebies and see if it mentions FAT32 support, but more easily the file dates. If the file dates for the operating system are July 11th, 1995, that is the original release. That's the one you want. You're also going to need a set of installation diskettes for Windows 3.1. And finally, as I kind of mentioned with the hard drives in these machines, you're going to need working workstations with copies of the operating systems that you plan to use. You need a running Windows 95 machine. The utility on this for configuring the server won't run on NT. So you need a Windows 95 machine, and it really is helpful to have an MS-DOS machine with network capability that you can use to copy MS-DOS up to the correct place on the server. And we'll talk about that and you'll see that. But those are really the keys to your success. If you are relatively familiar with PC hardware configuration, resource management, etc., hardware of this era, and networks, a little bit of network familiarity, you can do this. It shouldn't be all that difficult, but I say that knowing that PC hardware is particularly finicky, and I went through my fair share of trials and tribulations along the way. And in fact, along in this, I have a number of handwritten notes that I hope I remember. Otherwise, you'll get to see me screw up on camera. And now that I think we've covered the pertinence here, let's get right to it. And to follow along, I'm going to put up a copy of the documentation on the screen right alongside the screen of this machine with me down in the little corner, because this way, if you're curious what I look like when I'm stumbling along, you'll see. But the big two main events are right here. And I'll try my best to follow along with the documentation as we're going through this while I'm following along on paper here. So now, as I mentioned, what we're logging in here, this NT server does not have any of the remote boot items installed on it. In fact, all it has is the base install from the Windows NT Server CD-ROM, as well as Service Pack 6A, and a couple of drivers necessary for some creature comforts. My video card is a Riva TNT2 64, which isn't directly supported unless you put a driver on, and that requires a later service pack. Additionally, this mouse here is USB, which Windows NT doesn't officially support, but Dell does have a driver out there, and I found it. Now let's take a little bit of a look at the network configuration for this machine as it sits right now. As you can see, since we're running Windows 95 but on adjacent machines, I thought the name Chicago Suburb was rather fitting. And I've chosen to name my domain a Chicago Suburb. So I'm not from Chicago, I just really like the reference back to Windows 95. Taking a look at our services here, we really have the basic server, workstation, NetBIOS interface. IIS 3.0 is for an FTP server only. We'll talk about that. Protocols here, I just have NetBEUI, which is the only required protocol for this project. You do not need TCP/IP. And while you'll have the opportunity to configure it, it is for later in the workstation's boot cycle. It is not necessary to run or boot the machine over a network from NT server. But this here, you don't need TCP/IP. I have it here as a courtesy to make getting some files up to the server easier on my isolated network. And here's my network adapter. This is one thing I really wanted to talk about. I've chosen to use the 3COM Etherlink 3 3C509B card, the -TP one. You're looking at one right now on your screen. That card has all the things I need. I can turn off plug-and-play mode, I can configure its resources, and it has an option ROM socket with up to 32K of onboard option ROM. And even better, the option ROM that is necessary for this to be able to boot over a network can be found on the internet if you dig enough. I'm not going to be sharing that anywhere, but you can find it. I will tell you that when I installed the ROM, I did so on a virtual machine that I took a snapshot of in case the site was a little shifty. We'll say that. But I did get it. It did work. So that's my network adapter. Also, try your best to keep the interrupt and I/O base addresses the same on your client machines. It's not technically required, but it will make your life easier. Okay. And of course, we have our usual bindings. Now, of course, I've done nothing to set this machine up. So the first thing I want to do is actually create myself a user account. And this is before we even get into the documentation. And I'm just going to give myself a new user. I'm going to call it Chris. And I'm Chris. And I'm TJB Chris. And my password is my password. And I don't need to change it. And it never expires. And I'm going to give myself a group here. And actually, I think users will do. That'll be fine. Okay. And so now I think we have ourselves an account, and I should be able to log into the other workstations with that. Okay, there's that. Now, as you can see, I have the IIS guest account. We'll talk about that. I think that's all I need to do for here. Okay, the next item up for bids, I mentioned the FTP server. So the 2500SX25 doesn't have Microsoft LAN Manager on it. It, in fact, does have the MTCP installation on it with the FTP program. And rather than try and reconfigure this machine, which has a very pretty multi-boot setup that I really like, I figured I would in fact stick with using what I had, and that's going to be FTP. But I have to make a couple of changes. First off, it's configured to only allow anonymous connections. I don't want that. I'm sure I want to continue. Let's see. And then if I go to my directories that are available, by default, the inetpub directory does not allow writing. I need to fix that. Okay. And I don't think we have anything else here. I mean, I don't care about logging, but whatever. And we're going to click OK. And while we're at it, I'm going to just double check here that my FTP root is good. And this is where the MS-DOS files are going to go. I'll move them to the correct place once we get them up here, but at least this will do it. So let's do this. Check our security permissions, and everyone has full control. Boy, that's confidence inspiring. And again, security permissions. Same thing, everyone full control. Okay, now the share coming in, or the FTP server would limit it. I'm going to log in as my user account anyway that I just created. Okay, let's actually start installing the Remote Boot service on my Windows NT server. So you can see here, we already have the screen up. I'm going to fold my page over here. You're looking at the same page I am. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the shortcut over to Network Control Panel. And this thing just booted up, so yep, okay. And we're going to install the protocol first, and that is the DLC layer protocol. And it wants the Windows NT CD-ROM, my very official copy of which is right here. I'll throw that in the drive and wait for auto run to happen. You may have noticed an additional supplement to our video this evening sitting here waiting for me. There is our, and we are in DI 386. Okay. Next up, we're going to go to Services, and we're going to add the Remote Boot service. And I actually need to move your page one forward because we have moved to the next page. And we're going to go down and select Remote Boot. Now notice the manual here, and this is the NT4 Resource Kit, shows Windows NT 351 dialog boxes. Don't know why that is. It's going to copy some files, but the first thing it's going to do is ask me, where do I want to install the remote boot directory of the files? The documentation refers to your system root c1nt /rpl, and that is in fact where we will leave it. Okay, it wants to copy some files from DI386. Continue. Now it wants to copy the remote boot client files. These are located in the client's RPL directory of your NTCD. This is very important. Don't type 386, it's not going to work. And if you just kind of break out your jump to conclusions mat here, you might have a problem. So let's just do that. Okay. And here comes the RPL boot files. Now we're not done yet. I have a couple of other things I want. Now, I mentioned that I'm going to be using FTP to copy the MS-DOS files from my Tandy 2500 because I already conveniently have MTCP on there and don't want to dick around with MS LAN Manager. I need a DHCP server, and we're going to copy those files as well. If any adapters are using DHCP to obtain an IP address, they're now required to use a static IP already set. And we can take a look at that real quick by going here. And we can see we already have an address. This gateway is bunk. It doesn't go anywhere. And I think that's all we need. This should give me a DHCP server for MTCP later when we're going to install MS-DOS. This should give me remote boot configuration. And this gives me the DLC protocol. So I should have everything I need to go. And the following sections of this manual actually talk about installing remote boot service when you're converting from LAN Manager for OS2, for example. So that's not something we're going to work on, so we're just going to skip right past that and get right to installing MS-DOS files on the remote boot server. After we click close, let all of our bindings and adapter configurations take effect. And do you want to restart your computer now? Why, yes, after removing the CD-ROM, because it does have auto boot capabilities from the CD-ROM, I'm going to click on the yes button, and this machine is going to restart. I'll see you when it's done. Okay, all booted back up, ready to go, almost. And although this is not necessary for the remote boot portion, this next part is just necessary because I'm using TCP/IP and FTP to get my MS-DOS files over to this machine in the next set of steps. So I need to make sure that my DHCP server is configured, has a scope set up. Dismiss the welcome screen here. I like the welcome screen. It's just kind of fun. So let's see, DHCP manager here. And I need to double click you. I need to create a scope, and this is going to start at 192.168.0.3, 192.168.0.254. Don't put 255, it's the broadcast address. 0. And this is going to be the network. Really, it's the network. Okay, and I'm not excluding any addresses. 3-day lease, fine. It's been created, but it's not yet activated. Would you like to activate now? Yes. Okay, now I should have, no more data is available, that's fine. It just clicks, when you click this, there's no options set. So now I can set some DHCP options, they're not necessary, but if I look at my scope properties, I am in fact configured. So without taking that step and actually telling the DHCP server how it should respond, what it should respond with, what its ranges are, I won't actually do anything. So now that we have that set, let's take a trip over to the Tandy 2500 SX25, which is currently running Starfield Simulation Screensaver. And we fix that. Let's give this thing a reboot into MTCP-enabled environment here, and then we'll follow the steps for installing the MS-DOS files. And this is going to be a bit of a two-step on top of what you see in the instructions, and that's mainly because I am going to use FTP, and therefore I'm going to two-step these files up. So again, this machine has a disk in it for now. It very soon won't. Let's give this thing a boot. And of course, this is the step you're looking at now. Steps 1 and 2, where it has you connect your LAN manager-based machine up to a Samba share someplace, SMB. We're not doing that. I'm going to use MTCP. So of course, I'm going to flip you on to the next page. And this is where it has you copy all these files. And this is what we'll do. Now, this will see if I got my DHCP server working. There we go. Offer received. Good news, everyone. Great line from Futurama. Here we are. All right. And this is because this is a game night machine, it has one of my trademark menus on it for people to just be able to use it. But we're not using that now. Okay. All of the MS-DOS system files are required. So that's the 3 main files from the root directory. That includes io.sys, ms-dos.sys, and command.com, as well as all the files from the DOS directory. To make io.sys and ms-dos visible, I have to mess with their attributes as noted in step 3. So ms-dos.sys, -s, and DOS keys installed. So I'm just going to go do this. Okay, and now I'm going to FTP 192.168.0.2. And here I am connected to Chicago suburb. And my name is Chris from the user account I created, and I'm here. I should be there. Oh, okay, why can't I log in? We'll be right back after these messages. We'll be right back. All right, I think I found my problem. I forgot when I created my user account that by default NT server doesn't let regular plebe users like me log on locally, so I've got to fix that. So let's go fix that. And there we go. So I want to allow you to log on locally because that affects the FTP server. So, and I don't see any of my users here, so let's do this. Let's add users, because I'm pretty sure I set myself into the users group. So this way, domain users won't necessarily be able to log on, but at least local users to this machine can. And we'll double check here that I am in that group. I am. So now, I should be able, if I'm lucky, just get the camera back to where it belongs here. I should be able to log on locally. Let's see what happens here. All right, 192.168.0.2. And I am in fact Chris. And this is my password. And now I'm logged on. File transfer mode type set to I. Okay, this is the fun of this, folks. Take copious notes and you can still forget a step. So now we already have set the attributes on our files here. So I'm going to put io.sys, put ms-dos.sys, put command.com. Then we're going to cd to DOS, lcd DOS, sorry. I got to pay attention to my FTPs. And we're going to input star.star. Oh, actually, Q, prompt off. Let's do that. Okay, here we go. All these files are going to go, and I'll see you when they're done. Okay, now that all my files are copied up, I think we are ready to go back to the server, but I have to do one more thing. I need to re-attribute the two hidden in system files from the root of the drive, io.sys and ms.sys, back to their original positions. And then we'll just do ms-dos. Okay, now this machine is good to go. So let's go flip back to our server machine, and that's not going to do it. And now back at our server machine, the next step here is if we copy the files to a directory other than where they need to go, we need to copy them there. Well, we did, because as you'll recall, the FTP server's files are going in inetpub FTP root, and as you can see here, I have all of my MS-DOS files. So, looking here, I have to make sure I skip fast open. FTP blew up during that, so it's going to have a lock violation, but I don't really need it. But I should have pretty much everything else, and let's just do this to save me from not being able to see my files. And now we can see we have all the files. So there's MS-DOS sys, there's IO sys, there's all my files. Okay, so now I'm going to do this here. I actually like to leave a copy of Windows NT Explorer open, and we're going to go to WinNT. We're going to go to RPL. Remember, that's where we installed it. We're going to go to RPL files, bin files. I'm going to move this over here, and we're going to do DOS622. And you can see there's already a bootsect.com. That is actually the boot sector file that will be first fed back to the network adapter after it makes a request to the server and the server identifies it as a valid client. That's the actual boot sector part that will continue the IPL process via the network card. So now, I'm going to take all of these files, except for fast open, which blew up on me. I'm going to Control-C them, and I'm going to Control-V them. And look, there they are. And auto-arrange, okay, is on. There we go. Now the files are in place. It does tell you, by the way, as you can see, that if you have IBM PC-DOS, to rename IBMBIO.com and IBMDOS.com to MS-DOS.sys and IO.sys as necessary. Now it talks a little bit about starting and stopping the remote boot service, and we actually do need to make sure that the service is configured, and we want to set it to auto start when the machine starts. Because although we installed the network service, the system service is not yet running. So we're going to go to Control Panel and Services here, and we're going to type ARF, and we're going to scroll down a little more, and you can see my remote boot service is set to manual. So we're going to make it automatic, and we're going to click the old Start button. And if we're lucky, the service will start, as it in fact did. Alrighty. And then we're going to move on to the next page. And we're going to start the Remote Boot Manager client. So let's take a look at that client here. I'm going to leave these other windows open and close some of these other ones. And so we can find that here in Administrative Tools, Remote Boot Manager. And it says you cannot create or edit workstations until you create a profile. Okay, we will do that. And now the next step here is checking the Remote Boot installation. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to check configurations. So this will go through all the different directories that are in RPL files, bin files in your system root, and it will add profiles for operating systems whose system files are complete. And generally that means at least, I think, IOSys, MS-DOS-sys, command-com, and maybe a few others. All don't need to be there, but certainly the core files to boot do. The other thing we need to do is go fix security on the files, because in case there are any user rights problems from how I copied these over, we need to fix that. So now it talks to us about managing profiles. And profiles represent a combination of the hardware that you're using and the operating system with which you'll be using it. So I probably explained that way worse than the book did, but in fewer words. I guess that's good. Now let's create a profile. Got you up on the right page with me here. So we go here to Remote Boot and we say New Profile. And I'm going to give this a profile name. My first profile must be an MS-DOS profile. You always need a DOS profile. Whether you're installing Windows 95, you've got to start with a DOS profile. So I'm going to call this DOS 622 E-Link 3. And don't fill in the description, it'll fill in itself. And DOS 6.2 shows up in the list. That's good. That means I got the system files correct and in the right place. That's excellent, and it is DOS Etherlink 3. Okay. And as I mentioned here, you know, I only have one of each type of machine, so there's not going to be a lot of profiles. I'm mainly worried about the network adapter and the operating system. Let's go to the next page here, shall we? And then we talk a little bit about, you know, managing profiles. You can, you know, delete them, you can get their properties, but once you've created them, the only thing you can really change is the comment here. Oh crap, and actually I did that wrong. I'm glad I went and looked, because those of you who are watching me are yelling at your screen. Because I accidentally clicked the Etherlink 2 and not the Etherlink 3. There we go. See, this is why you double check your work, folks. And now that would have been perplexing. Why the hell doesn't this work? Well, now it will. And again, Etherlink 3 is one of those cards for which NT includes the real mode drivers for MS-DOS 6. So, and of course, I can delete the profile, as you just saw, recreate it, and now we talk about managing clients. So within each of these various, just go to the new profile thing here, each of these has associated with it one or more OUIs, organizationally unique identifiers, or as Microsoft calls them, I forget what Microsoft calls them, we'll see them on the next pages, vendor IDs, I think that's what they call them. And that is what was, I guess, unofficial term for the first 3 bytes of a MAC address, which is generally used to identify the vendor who made the card. And you see this in your own home routers, you know, or anything else, where it's like Cisco Systems, or Wachtell International, or, you know, 3Com, or whatever, IBM. The MAC address is important here because if the OUI or vendor ID of a card, the first 3 bytes of the MAC address, is not associated with the profile in question, you can't add the machine. We'll see that in just a little bit. So we're going to flip to the next page. And it tells us how to add a new client. Okay. And there are 2 ways to add a client. I can go in and I can say, I want a new workstation. And I can type in 00203521C06E. Which is the address of my student token ring card when I was in college. True story. It is an IBM Turbo 16.4 ISA token ring adapter, for those wondering. Or you can have the machine attempt to auto boot, fail, and when it does, Windows NT will log a workstation record which you can convert to auto boot, so you don't have to type all this crap in. So now I think it's the appropriate time to get the Tandy 2500 SX25 apart. We're going to remove the XT IDE Universal BIOS. We're going to disconnect the hard drive. I'm going to stick in the auto boot ROM, and then we're going to boot her back up and let her fail. Okay, there we are. All taken apart and put back together. I've removed the XT IDE Universal BIOS and put the network boot ROM in its place. Now, The hard drive is this SD card, or I mean, sorry, the CF card, which I've now just removed, so I didn't have to do any disconnection on the inside there. And now I'm going to boot the thing up. But before we can have it send a boot request to the server in order for me to automatically convert the profile to DOS622, I actually have to configure the network card to enable it to use the larger boot ROM. The existing ROM that was in there was 8K, and now this one is 32. So we've got the card for the computer set up. We're going to power on the machine again. And we should, in fact, get an error message from the network card telling us to enable a 32K ROM, at which time MS-DOS will boot from the floppy. You'll note the lack of XT IDE Universal BIOS text on the screen when it finishes post here. Skip the memory test. Little floppy seek. There we go. 3C5X9B requires 32K ROM size. So it figured that out. We'll press F1. And you'll see after the beep that there is no XT IDE Universal BIOS display on there. So even if I left the card in there, it probably wouldn't boot. But this is supposed to be diskless when we're done with this, so it won't have a floppy disk in the drive. And I probably should have had F5 there. Did I get it? No, I get to do it again, because this is an MS-DOS setup disk. There we go, boot bypassing startup files. All right, let's pop in the 3C509, my very official utility diskette with my handwritten goodness on there. Throw that right into the drive, 3C5X9CFG. Okay, we're going to configure the NIC. And while you're here, take a note of the resources. This is 300 hex for a base address, interrupt 10. Now for MS-DOS, this generally tends not to bite us too much. For Windows 95, we're going to want to pay closer attention. So we're going to tab up here. We're going to hit enter on the boot ROM. And see, we're set for 8K, so I'm going to go 32. OK. And we're going to go down to OK with the tab and then the enters and the things. Configuration is now being saved. That's a good sign. It didn't whine at me about the ROM not being installed. Let's go to quit. There we go. So now if I remove the floppy disk from the machine, one more note. The boot ROM that I have in here is actually meant to be installed in an electrically erasable PROM that goes into the card that's programmable from another utility. This is the BootWorks ROM for the 3C509 cards. But I don't have any of those compatible ROMs, so I had to burn a copy to the ROM. And that copy actually tries to boot P by default. So every time I boot these machines, I have to flip it to RPL. And that's done by pressing Control-Alt-B when the card's copyright screen first comes up. So if I got this right, we'll see that copyright screen. I'll hit Control-Alt-B, and it will work. We'll Control-Alt-Del. Skip the memory test. Come on, Schwartz. There we go. OK, I got it. OK, so you can see I can even change the card's interrupt configuration, things like that. But I'm going to go down here. I'm going to hit minus, and then I'm going to press the F10 key to save the setting. And now you can see that it is, in fact, searching for RPL server, and it just keeps trying over and over. So now, if I flip back to the Dell VidCap over here, and I'm right here, hey there, I can now go and hit F5 here, and look, there is this address that 00A02413EB92. That is the machine that is currently trying to RPL its way into the server. But of course, that is not going to work. So what I'm going to do here is actually show you why that's not going to work. So let's click this and say Convert Adapters. And now here's where we have to choose a configuration and profile type. And as you can see, I'm following along here with the instructions. They're up on your page, on your screen there on the right. It wants me to choose between a shared profile and a personal profile. Shared profiles are for machines where like I said, you're working with a fleet of machines, you've got a whole bunch of configurations, something like that. A personal profile lets you set up an individual profile per machine. This could get laborious, so I imagine what I would do is I would set up a lot of shared profiles for the machines. They all get their own data areas and things, but set up a profile for a fleet of machines, and then when you have individual one-offs and snowflakes for the special people and the higher-ups, you can create personal profiles for them. TCP/IP, I'm not bothering with that. We're just dealing with MS-DOS and Windows 3.1 here. And you can see here it matches a profile, but I can't actually do it. Well, why is that? And this is what I was talking about before with the OUI or the vendor ID. Because if Workstation's vendor ID is not present, then it won't be recognized as being valid for that particular card. So what I have to do is go in and configure the remote boot system so that it will recognize the MAC address, the first 6 characters that are coming from this card, the OUI or vendor ID, as being a 3COM Etherlink 3 card. And so I'm going to do this now. What we have to do here is find where in the instructions it talks about the utility to do this, and I'll give you a hint, it is not a pointy-clicky thing. So the remote boot setup here on Windows NT comes with a small little command line utility called RPL-CMD, and this is something that can be run from the command line. I'm just going to go here and run a command prompt. And actually, one thing I did not do, because this is a fresh install, is I need to make sure that I have history turned on here, because if I don't, I'm going to have a problem. Screen buffer size, I'm going to go with 300, should be enough. And I'm going to go with OK. I'm going to apply this to everything. And you can see I got a scroll bar over here. So now I can run RPL-CMD. And there are a couple of different scenarios for using RPL-CMD to add adapters that are not in the system. The first set is to add vendor IDs for drivers that are already in the system, which is our case. We have Etherlink 3 support in there. The drivers are there. This just doesn't recognize my card as being compatible. The other is to add in a card from scratch. And this is why I highly suggest that you use cards that are already kind of supported, because even if you have to add the MAC address, it's less steps. So let's do this. We're going to take a look at creating a new boot record for this particular adapter, but to do that, we need to take a look and see an existing one that's actually going to have the information we need to copy pasta. So let's do this. We're going to go boot, we're going to enum, and we're going to give information level 2. Enum is enumerate or list. And here we get a whole bunch of various bits of information here. We've got a boot name here, DOS-I, that's an internal name that we're actually going to have to reuse. So, for example, I'll actually talk about that later. We got a boot comment, IBM DOS Ethernet. It tells us about the vendor name, that's the OUI, the MAC address. Scrolling up here, I'm looking for the Etherlink 3 one. And let's see here. There it is, DOS-H. So we've got DOS-H here. I've got DOS 3COM Etherlink 3, and I've got 0020AF. And the big thing that's important here is I need this boot block thing, because I'm not going to remember this. Enter. So now that we know what we need to do, I'm going to go back here to my menu, and it is boot. I'm going to add. Now it's DOS-H. The vendor name, and that is the OUI, or first 3 bytes of the MAC address, the vendor ID as Microsoft likes to call it, and that is 00A024. The BBC file, there we go. This is why I copy pasta things, because I don't have to type it and mess it up. By the way, if you mess it up, the client will start to boot and then stop. Ask me how I know. Boot comment. Okay, this is a DOS Etherlink 3 00A024. Window size was 0. All right, now that we're all at it, I've flipped our manual back to where we're going, because now I have one more thing I have to do. I need to now actually give this a workstation profile. So what I'm going to have to do is cancel that. I'm going to have to redo the convert adapter. Oh, look, it automatically filled this in. There's no more X, so I should be good to go. All right, let's do this again. This is Tandy 2500. This is Tandy 2500, SX25. Probably shouldn't have typed all that crap before, right? Should have just gotten to the point, but hey. Tandy 2500, all lowercase. Don't forget that password. Again, shared profile. We have our profile set. Don't care about TCP IP. Okay, let's flip over to the Tandy 2500. And let's power it up and see what we get. Once again, remembering to A, skip the memory test, and B, press Control-Alt-B once the Etherlink 3 initialization thing comes up after it beeps. That's now. There we go. Minus F10. There we go, we're booting. Okay, so the very first thing that happens now is we are prompted for the workstation username. Now this is the username that will be used to IPL the machine. That's what you just put in the profile. I'm pointing to the NT server screen here. That's Tandy 2500. You can see that it already suggests that it's Tandy 2500 because, of course, it knows based on the MAC address of the machine. And of course, the password I typed is Tandy 2500 in lowercase. Starting MS-DOS, baby. Look at that. RPL link, HIMEM is testing extended memory. Time for a sip of the celebration stuff. This here is bourbon. That tastes almost as good as victory does, folks. Okay, it couldn't load the workstation into high memory. That's because there's no EMM386 setup. And command completed successfully. So now, as you can see, we are now booted up. The person at the console should immediately log on as their own ID, and that's because I'm currently logged on as Tandy 2500. So the machine will kind of be able to see some things, but probably not all. So let's not log on, and I will just type Chris. I'll type my password as it is on the NT server. Do I first want to log off? The answer is yes. Okay. The server successfully logs you on as Chris. This is why you set up a domain controller, by the way. If you don't, the client will sit here for about 10 or 15 seconds trying to find a server to validate your login. And then you'll get a message telling you you were logged on, but no server validated you, so it may or may not work. This makes it way faster. My privilege level on this domain is user, and I was last logged on 7:49 p.m. on today. And there we are, we're in. So let's take a look at what we're looking at here. So we've got an interesting set of directories here. We've got our DOS directory. And I think I got DOS shell on here. Nope, no DOS shell. Okay, but I have QBasic on here. Oop, if I can type it. This is my typical videos, folks. I get in front of a camera and typing does not happen. Okay, yep, okay, there we go. QBasic, yay! Edit, config, sys, I can MS-DOS editor. I have a data directory. Actually, so let's do this first. So I have a data directory, but I have a data directory because when you use NTFS as the file system on your server, you can't write everywhere on this drive. There's some places you can and some places you can't. It's like magic. So for example, let's edit config.sys. Let's add device. I cannot edit a read-only file. Okay, so file new. Okay, let's go. I'll use an old Tandy phrase. Hello, you rummy buzzard. File save. Hello. .text. Edit was unable to create or access the file. I don't have access to the root directory. Okay. Well, it turns out I can put it in CData. That is a writable storage location for the workstations. Hello.text. And there we are. So now, if I go to data, there we are, hello.text, and I can even go so far. And that, for the uninitiated, is a phrase that's kind of in Tandy lore. I also know that it's regionally appropriate for those of you from the right country. But it actually did make its way onto a TRIS-DOS 1.3 disk on the TRS-80 Model 3, and due to an error in the operating system, it was not in allocated sectors, but would display when people listed files from TRIS-DOS ready. Fun fact, I did a video on it. I wouldn't call it my best work, but I did do it, and I am fascinated by that story. Anyway, back to the lecture at hand. So now we're looking at, you can see some other folders here. We've got landman.dos, which is going to be useful if we need to do any net shares, which we will actually be doing when we come to Windows 95. It's net use, you idiot. Can't share any directories in here. There we go. There are no entries in the list. I could log on as administrator here and use the administrative share, but I'm not going to do that. That's basically it. Of course, let's take a look at the next page in the documentation here for you. And it does make the very important point that if you have local disks in your machine, this doesn't. Drive C is, in fact, the network drive. There's no hard disk on this machine. If you had a hard drive in this machine, the first hard drive would be D, the first network drive would be C. So the network drives come first, and then your hard drives, and then any other drives. Your shared drives that you map on the server, CD-ROM drives, whatever, whatever you have. So that's MS-DOS. It's actually pretty straightforward. So now, I think what we need to do is we need to set up Windows 3.1. And that's going to take a couple of steps involving these disks, this very same machine. We're going to have to install the files up to the network. And then once we're done with that, we're going to have to come back to those network installed files and run a local copy of setup here back on the Tandy 2500. So let's go do that now. So installing Windows 3.1, adding it, is not actually all that difficult. Because we already have the first two steps done for the instructions that you can see on the side of your screen, We've created an MS-DOS install and profile. We've joined a workstation to it. We've booted it up. It works. Now all we have to do is reboot the client and log in with administrator privileges on the server. And this is going to let us write files to places that we normally wouldn't be able to with my currently logged on user account. So let's do that now. Give this a reboot. And there we go. All right, this time we are administrator. And here comes my password. Now the thing will boot up as per usual, starting MS-DOS. This does not get old, folks. The fact that I'm booting MS-DOS from a network is really freaking cool. And of course, now it says if the client doesn't have a floppy disk drive, you can do this at the server. There's ways you can do this, but quite frankly, yeah, this has a floppy disk drive, and I have here some floppy disks. So what we're going to do is it tells us to insert the first Windows 3.1 diskette in drive A. We're going to go setup, find the A drive, setup/A. And this will automatically put the files in the right place on the server. So once I'm done here, everything will be where I need it to be. But that's not a fully installed version of Windows 3.1. That's just a place from which I can install Windows into another profile. So this is kind of a two-step process. You install the Windows setup files to then run setup to install into a profile. So we're on part A of that. And I want to press enter to continue. Okay, please enter your full name or group name and the name of your company. So this is going to be TJB Chris. This is the Charles E. Tandy TRS 80 Emporium. That's what we call the room. The wife cross-stitched me a thing. You're probably looking at it now. We're going to press enter. Okay, type the full path to the network directory you want the files copied to. And that is going to be actually C:\/ is what the documentation tells us here on step 6. All right, yep. And now it's going to go through the process of copying all 6 Windows floppies. I'm not going to make you watch this. Okay, the file copy phase is finally complete. That took its sweet time. Take the last disk out of the drive here. There's 6. This is Windows 3.11. Put these back in their little official Microsoft baggie here. And once they're in, we will press any key to return to the MS-DOS prompt. And here we are. That's right, fail. Said fail. C:. Okay, should have left him in there until I exited. Doesn't matter, who cares. Now we're back to the C prompt. So now the next part of the process is I have to go back to the server and I have to create a new profile for Windows 3.1 into which I can install the actual Windows 3.1 installation. We've got the setup files on the server, but we don't have an actual working installation yet. So in order to separate Windows 3.1 users from non-Windows 3.1 users, you know, those machines that might not be able to run it, we've got to create a new profile on the machine. And I've got the instructions up on your screen for you. So the first thing we're going to do is go to Remoteboot and new profile. I'm going to call this Win31 eLink3. And I'm not going to create a description again because it'll just get written over. And now this would be probably a little confusing for some folks. I'm going to choose the DOS 622 Etherlink 3 configuration. And the reason I'm choosing this is the configuration is the underlying operating system and hardware config that will power Windows 3.1. And that is DOS 622. That's the operating system that's booting. And that is, in fact, the network card driver. And this creates a separate profile space on the server for these clients that'll have Windows 3.1 to segregate them from those that won't. So, like I said, PCXT clients won't see it, so they won't get all excited and try to run it. So now we're going to click OK here. And then we're going to assign the profile to the workstation. That's step 2. I'm just going to double-click the workstation here. And now you can see I can choose Win31 Etherlink 3. And I'm going to click OK. And now we're going to reboot this workstation. And it's going to boot up exactly the same way because essentially I have the same profile. Time to press Control-Alt-Del. And I'll skip the memory test here. Skippy. And floppy seek. Control-B, do, minus F10. And we should get a starting MS-DOS. And like I was saying before, it looks like the MS-DOS profile. Tandy 2500 is correct. It is just like it because we haven't customized it to make it different from the MS-DOS profile yet, and that's what we're going to do right now when we run Windows Setup. So now looking at, uh-oh, crap. I realize I was supposed to run this with administrator creds and got ahead of myself. So Control-Alt-Del, Control-Alt-B, minus F10, and this should boot MS-DOS. Now, I was saying before, this is going to look like the MS-DOS profile because I haven't actually customized it yet, so there's no difference from the other one. There will be soon, though. Now, I have to log in with administrator privileges again because I have to be able to write to places that the machine account and my account, my Chris account, can't write. So let's log in like that. And now this should start MS-DOS and continue to boot. Once it does, we're going to move on to installing the network version of Windows from that network installation directory that we just created in the previous set of steps. Okay, all booted up. We are going to go to the Win directory, as noted here in step 4, and we're going to run the setup/n command. Checking my machine here to make sure you're all seeing the same stuff. I think you are. We're going to press enter. Now, the instructions specifically tell us that we want to run Express setup. So we're going to do that. Enter for Express. And then this says the network software in your system will work correctly with Windows 3.1. However, your network vendor has new software available, yada, yada, yada. Don't care, not permanent. Press enter. Now it's going to start Windows. This is the coolest part to me, the fact that we're literally running Windows over a network right now. I know it's just setup, but it's still cool. And yeah, I'm going to make you sit through all this. The great thing is this is a fast install because it doesn't really have to copy much. And we're loading, and we're loading. I mean, this is a network. I see a bunch of activity. Here we go. Files are copying. And now we're already to the printers part. So I'm going to say install no printer attached. Sets up some of our program groups. See how fast that Windows setup is, folks? It's pretty cool. Okay, now we're searching for stuff to install. Edit.com is the MS-DOS editor. We have the ping utility. There we go. We can run the tutorial, or we can skip the tutorial. Skip. And now we're going to return to MS-DOS because it tells us we need to restart the machine. So now we've returned to the MS-DOS prompt, and it's time to copy the Windows installation files to a place where they are accessible by other machines in the profile. And this is here on step 8. So what we're going to do here is we're going to xcopy/e, and we're going to go from C:\Windows to C:\wksta.pro/win. And this will copy all the files from the Windows directory I just installed, again, over to the other directory. And then 9, reboot the client and log on, which is exactly what we're going to do right now. And since the machine is already on the Windows 3.1 profile, we have Windows. And of course, the MS-DOS 622 profile that I created earlier remains untouched. It does not have a copy of Windows in it. And Control-Alt-B and -F10. Okay, this time I can log on with a machine account. And all booted up. The big difference between this and the previous boot is that we now have Smart Drive Disk Cache, which is pretty necessary for Windows anyway, but with a network it's even more necessary. So now I can just start Windows by typing win. And yeah, we're running Windows from a network. How crazy is that? There's no hard drive in this machine. It's literally, you can't see the activity lights. My activity lights on my switch here are going bonkers. But actually, when there's only one other station on the network, it performs pretty quickly. It's actually not bad. For a 386 machine, it's honestly relatively close to the performance you get with regular disks. And see, we have our awesome MS-DOS prompt. I want that in a window, though. And of course, you know, this is things I have to do. Turn off save settings and exit. Save it this way. We've got to play some solitaire because this is work and we're screwing off. So we have that available to us. We've got our usual control panel goodness here. We got main control panel. I can set myself a screensaver. And I'll just do Starfield simulation. What's that look like? Oh, it looks like that. There you go. It's a pretty standard Windows installation. Now, one thing you may have noticed, the eagle-eyed among you, is that the DOS prompt on this, the system prompt, has a space between the greater than signs. You've got C:\\/ and then greater than. And then there's a space between it and the cursor. And if you contrast that to a usual MS-DOS prompt, say that we saw on the command line here on the NT server, or on Windows before I had disconnected the disks, that space wasn't there. I've noticed that on both Windows 3.1 and, as you'll see later, Windows 95 clients, diskless clients put a space between that and the greater than sign and where the cursor is. I don't know if this is intentional. Is it some sort of subliminal signal to people like me that, hey, this is a network boot workstation? Or am I just imagining things? I don't know. But I have, in fact, made that observation. And that's pretty much it. That is booting Windows 3.1 over a network with no disks. I always associated Windows 3.1 with hard disks. It's really cool that you can boot it from a Windows NT server over a 100 megabit Ethernet LAN. I really like doing that. It's kind of fun. Okay, so next is going to be installing Windows 95. We're going to get Windows 95 server-based setup installed on the server using the still hard disk enabled MMPC Model 20. Then we're going to disable its disks, remove the XTID Universal BIOS, and then we're going to really install Windows 95 and boot it. And that's got a lot more caveats that I hope I get right the first time, or you are going to get to watch me screw up a lot. Let's get right to that. And so that concludes part 1. We've exceeded our allotted time, and we're going to wait until part 2 to tackle Windows 95. Will it work? Will TJB Chris stop blathering so much? What else can he tell us that we don't already know? You'll get answers to those questions and many more in part 2, so stay tuned to the channel, folks. Thanks again for watching.